In June 2023, people all over the world became obsessed with a countdown. News stations had timers on screen 24 hours a day. Social media was flooded with theories. Rescue experts were being interviewed non-stop, and every few hours there seemed to be another update that made people believe maybe, just maybe, there was still time. Because somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean, thousands of feet below the surface, a small submersible carrying 5 passengers had vanished. And if you're new here, my name's Kodi, and on this channel, we dive into the stories that stay with people long after the headlines disappear. The unsettling cases, the internet mysteries, the disasters, the things that make you sit there afterwards thinking about them way longer than you probably should. And honestly, this story became one of those stories for a lot of people. I remember opening TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, literally everything, and every single platform was talking about this thing. People were tracking oxygen levels, sharing maps of the search area, posting fake updates, conspiracy theories, countdowns, and after a while, it almost stopped feeling real. It felt like the entire internet had become locked into this massive life event together. But underneath all the media coverage and the speculation was something genuinely horrifying. The ocean where the sub disappeared is one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Down there, there's no light, no sense of direction, and enough pressure surrounding you to crush most things instantly. Humans were never meant to exist at that depth, and yet somehow people had turned visiting the wreck of the RMS Titanic sinking into a luxury experience. Now, as rescue crews searched the ocean and millions of people waited for answers, another conversation quietly started happening online. Because some experts weren't asking how the passengers could still be alive. They were asking if the ending had already happened the moment communication was lost. And when details started coming out afterward, the warning signs, the lawsuits, the safety concerns, the reports that people inside the industry had been sounding alarms for years, the story became a lot bigger than just a missing submersible. It became a story about ambition, ego, risk, and what happens when people start believing the rules no longer apply to them. And maybe the creepiest part of all of this is how quickly the entire world moved on after it was over. For a few days, this was all anybody could talk about, and then suddenly, silence. No more countdowns, no more headlines, no more updates, just another tragedy swallowed by the internet after everyone got their answer. But the deeper you look into what happened to the Titan submersible, the more complicated and unsettling the entire story becomes. So, grab a light and let's step into the dark together. Long before the Titan submersible ever disappeared, people had become obsessed with one thing sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean: the wreck of the RMS Titanic sinking. And over time, I think people started forgetting what the Titanic wreck actually is. It's not some underwater museum attraction or a theme park destination. It's a mass grave sitting nearly 13,000 feet below the surface in complete darkness. There are parts of the ocean down there that humans have barely explored, and somehow over the years, visiting the Titanic slowly became this weird luxury achievement for rich explorers and thrill seekers. Because eventually, for some people, standing on top of Mount Everest just wasn't enough anymore. They wanted something rarer, more dangerous, something that very few humans on Earth would ever experience, and companies realized there was money in selling that feeling. And one of those companies was OceanGate, founded by a man named Stockton Rush. The more you learn about Stockton Rush, the more complicated this story becomes, because he genuinely didn't see himself as reckless. He saw himself as a pioneer, somebody pushing humanity forward in a new era of exploration. He came from wealth, had a background in engineering and aviation, and seemed completely obsessed with the idea that innovation only happened when people stopped being afraid to take risks. But there's a huge difference between calculated risk and convincing yourself safety rules are just obstacles standing in the way of greatness. And the deeper you look into Rush's interviews and public statements, the more that mindset starts becoming impossible to ignore. Even at one point, while speaking about the deep sea industry, Rush stated, quote, "There hasn't been an injury in commercial sub-industry in over 35 years. It's obscenely safe," end quote. And hearing that now, after knowing eventually what happened, is honestly chilling. Because the ocean is not safe. It doesn't care how experienced you are, how much money you have, or how revolutionary you think your ideas might be. Once you descend that far underwater, human beings are completely at the mercy of pressure and darkness. Every single inch deeper into the ocean increases the force pressing against you, and at Titanic depth, that pressure becomes almost impossible to comprehend. And somehow, despite all of that, OceanGate wanted to make deep-sea tourism more accessible. The company started developing submersibles capable of bringing paying customers down to the historic wrecks, including the Titanic itself. But unlike many deep-sea vessels operated by major scientific organizations, OceanGate wanted to approach things differently. And differently became one of the biggest concerns surrounding the company. Titan used a carbon fiber hull combined with titanium end caps instead of relying entirely on traditional materials more commonly trusted within the deep-sea exploration industry. On paper, it sounded innovative, lighter weight, modern engineering, a completely new approach. But experts inside the submersible community were deeply uncomfortable with it, because carbon fiber behaves unpredictably under repeated extreme pressure, and unlike metals that often show signs of weakening before catastrophic failure, carbon fiber can deteriorate internally without visible warning signs. Which is terrifying considering this thing is meant to travel thousands of feet beneath the ocean's surface. And concerns about Titan weren't just random internet criticism that appeared after the implosion happened. People inside the industry had reportedly been raising alarms years earlier. Former employees questioned the vessel's safety testing, and one OceanGate employee even filed a lawsuit after claiming he believed the submersible could place passengers in extreme danger. But Stockton Rush seemed convinced that caution itself was becoming the problem. At one point, while discussing safety concerns, Rush stated, quote, "At some point, safety is just pure waste," end quote. And honestly, that might be one of the most haunting quotes connected to this entire story. Because when you're talking about exploring one of the harshest environments on Earth, most people probably want the company building a submersible to be obsessed with safety, not treating it like it's an obstacle. Rush also spoke openly about breaking rules within the industry, and at one point even said, quote, "I've broken some rules to make this happen," end quote. Now to him, statements like that probably sounded ambitious, visionary even, the kind of mindset Silicon Valley praises constantly. Move fast, innovate, challenge outdated systems. The problem is, the ocean isn't Silicon Valley. You don't get to refresh the page and try again if something fails down there. And as OceanGate continued pushing forward with Titan expeditions, more and more people within the deep-sea exploration world reportedly became nervous about what was happening. The terrifying part is that outside of that world, almost nobody was paying attention yet. As OceanGate continued developing Titan and preparing for deeper expeditions, the concerns surrounding the company weren't going away. If anything, they were getting louder. And this is the point of the story where hindsight becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because so many of the warnings people would later discover after the implosion already existed publicly years before it happened. The deeper Titan went into the Atlantic Ocean, the more nervous some experts became about the fact that the submersible was repeatedly diving to depths that put unimaginable stress on the hull every single time. And to really understand why that mattered, you have to understand just how violent the environment around the Titanic wreck actually is. The Titanic sits roughly 13,000 feet below the ocean's surface. At that depth, the pressure surrounding the submersible is around 6,000 pounds per square inch. Every dive meant Titan's hull was being squeezed by enormous force from every direction. And unlike traditional deep-sea vessels that relied heavily on thick metal pressure spheres, Titan's carbon fiber hull created uncertainty that many people in the industry simply just did not trust. Now, carbon fiber is incredibly strong in some situations, but repeated pressure cycles deep underwater are a completely different thing. Each dive potentially weakened the structure little by little in ways that may not even be visible from the outside. And that uncertainty became one of the biggest criticisms surrounding OceanGate. And the scary part is, there were people directly involved with the company who repeatedly tried sending them that alarm. One former employee, David Lockridge, reportedly raised serious concerns about Titan's safety during inspections and testing. According to legal documents, Lockridge warned that more non-destructive testing should be performed on the hull before human passengers were repeatedly taken to the extreme depths. But tension inside the company reportedly escalated after those concerns were raised. OceanGate actually later sued Lockridge, and according to the lawsuit, the company claimed he had improperly shared confidential information. Lockridge meanwhile argued he had genuine safety concerns regarding the vessel. And looking back now, it's hard not to see moments like this differently. This wasn't just random people online saying the sub looked sketchy after the tragedy happened. There were actual professionals inside the field questioning whether the Titan should be doing these dives at all. At one point, an industry group called the Marine Technology Society reportedly sent a letter expressing concern that OceanGate's experimental approach could lead to catastrophic problems. And even then, Stockton Rush seemed determined to continue pushing forward. During interviews, Rush often spoke about regulation almost like it was something holding humanity back. At one point, he even stated, quote, "You know there's a limit. At some point, safety is just pure waste." End quote. And honestly, every time I read that quote, it gets worse. This wasn't somebody building a phone app or testing software. This was a man taking people into the deadliest environments on the planet where there is absolutely no room for failure. And despite the criticism, OceanGate continued gaining attention. Titan itself started becoming part of the fascination online because people were both intrigued and deeply confused by it. Videos of the submersible started circulating. Photos of the interior spread online, and people became obsessed with details, like the fact that the vessel was partially controlled using a modified Logitech gaming controller. You don't hear that every day. I mean, now to be fair, using gaming controllers and advanced machinery isn't automatically unheard of, and some experts pointed that out afterward. But mixed with all the other concerns surrounding the submersible, it became one more detail that made the entire operation feel strange to people watching from the outside. Especially because Titan didn't really resemble what most people imagined when they thought about deep-sea submersibles. The inside looked cramped, improvised almost. Passengers sat cross-legged on the floor. There were very limited comforts, and communication with the surface relied heavily on text-style messaging systems. Even entering the vessel required the hatch to be bolted shut from the outside. And maybe none of that alone means disaster was guaranteed, but when you combine all of it together with the safety concerns, the lawsuits, the warning signs from experts, and Russia's public attitude towards regulation, the picture starts becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But despite everything, OceanGate kept diving. And for a while, it seemed like Stockton Rush was proving his critics wrong. Titan successfully completed expeditions to the Titanic wreck, and each successful mission likely reinforced the belief inside the company that their approach was working. That confidence only seemed to grow over time, and publicly, OceanGate continued presenting itself as the future of private sea deep exploration. But underneath that confidence, there were still moments that quietly hinted things were not as under control as they appeared. Reports later surfaced about previous dives losing communication with the surface. Some expeditions reportedly experienced technical issues, and passengers from earlier trips would later describe situations where Titan seemed to struggle underwater in ways that made them uncomfortable. One passenger even described losing contact during the previous expedition for hours. And when you're sitting in a small experimental submersible thousands of feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, losing communication with the surface is not a small problem. Once you're down there, there's no quick rescue. Like, keep that in mind. There is nobody that can come down there quickly to help you. There's no immediate escape. Just darkness, pressure, and miles of ocean in every direction. But Stockton Rush seemed convinced that caution itself was the problem. By June 2023, despite all the criticism and growing concern surrounding OceanGate, Titan was still making dives to the wreck of the Titanic. And publicly, OceanGate continued presenting these expeditions almost like the future of exploration. Wealthy passengers could pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the chance to see one of the most famous shipwrecks in human history with their own eyes. But when you really look at what these dives actually involved, it's honestly terrifying. To reach the Titanic wreck, Titan had to descend nearly 13,000 feet into the Atlantic Ocean. The dive itself could take around 2 hours, and during that entire descent, passengers were trapped inside a cramped vessel surrounded by darkness and pressure strong enough to destroy them instantly if anything failed. And this wasn't some spacious, high-tech submarine most people think about when they think about movies. The inside of the Titan was extremely small. Passengers sat cross-legged on the floor, packed tightly together with very little room to move around. There weren't rows of seats, windows everywhere, or elaborate control panels. Most of the interior looked surprisingly minimal for something carrying people to one of the harshest environments on the Earth. Even entering the submersible feels unsettling looking back now. Once everyone climbed inside, the hatch was sealed from the outside using multiple bolts, which meant once the dive started, the people inside could not open it themselves, even if they reached the surface again. They were completely dependent on the crew outside of the vessel. And let's be real, that detail alone is enough to make my anxiety spike. Now, once the Titan started descending, there was no quick way out. No emergency escape. No direct rescue waiting nearby if something went wrong. Just a small vessel slowly disappearing into the darkness deeper than almost any human being will ever experience. On board the final dive were 5 people. Stockton Rush himself would be piloting the expedition alongside British explorer Hamish Harding, French Titanic expert Paul Henry, and Pakistani businessman Shahzada, alongside with his 19-year-old son, Solomon Dawood. And out of everyone on board, Solomon would eventually become one of the most heartbreaking parts of this entire story. Because after the implosion, family members would later reveal that Solomon reportedly had serious reservations about going on the trip in the first place. According to interviews given afterwards, he was nervous about the dive and reportedly wasn't enthusiastic about it, but ultimately decided to go because his father really wanted to do the expedition together for Father's Day. That detail completely changed the way a lot of people viewed this tragedy afterward. Because at first, a huge portion of the internet treated this story almost like some bizarre billionaire adventure gone wrong. There were memes everywhere, people making jokes about the controller, people mocking the passengers for spending so much money to visit the Titanic. But when the story about Solomon started spreading, the tone shifted for a lot of people. Because suddenly this wasn't a story about thrill seekers. It was also a story of a teenager sitting inside an experimental submersible thousands of feet beneath the ocean alongside his father. On the morning of June 18, 2023, the Titan began its descent towards the Titanic wreck site from the support ship above. Now at first, everything seemed normal. Communication through Titan and the surface crew functioned through a text-based messaging system, and throughout the early part of the descent, the submersible continued sending updates while slowly sinking deeper and deeper into the Atlantic Ocean. And this is where the environment around them becomes genuinely hard to comprehend. As Titan descends, sunlight would have disappeared completely. Outside the vessel, there would have been nothing visible except black water stretching endlessly in every direction. No ocean floor beneath them yet, no reference points, no sense of scale, just darkness and pressure increasing every second they continued downward. And all while, the hull of the Titan was carrying the weight of the ocean around it. Thousands and thousands of pounds of pressure pressing against the vessel from every single direction as it descended further away from the surface. Then, roughly an hour and 45 minutes into the dive, communication with the Titan suddenly stopped. No more messages, no updates, just silence. At first, nobody immediately assumed the worst. Communication issues during deep sea dives weren't completely unheard of, and when Titan stopped responding to messages from the surface, there was still hope that contact would be re-established. But as time passed and communication still hadn't returned, concern quickly started turning into panic. And once news broke publicly that the submersible carrying 5 passengers near the wreck of the Titanic was missing, the entire world became obsessed almost overnight. Search crews from multiple countries began mobilizing into the North Atlantic. Aircraft scanned the ocean's surface. Ships carrying sonar equipment moved into the area, and remotely operated underwater vehicles were deployed at an attempt to locate the Titan somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean. But the deeper reality of the situation was horrifying. Nobody even knew exactly where the Titan was. It could have been floating on the surface, unable to communicate. It could have been trapped somewhere underwater. or it could have already suffered some kind of catastrophic failure. And because the Titan carried a limited oxygen supply, the story quickly became attached to one thing that completely consumed the internet: the countdown. Every major news station started displaying estimates showing how much breathable oxygen the passengers supposedly had left. Social media became flooded with hourly updates, countdown timers, theories and speculation, and honestly, I don't think I've ever seen the internet collectively lock into one story quite like this before. Everywhere you looked, people were talking about the Titan. TikTok creators were making breakdown videos every hour. Live streams were tracking rescue updates in real time. And random people online suddenly became deep sea experts overnight. Some people were posting diagrams explaining how the submersible worked, while others were spreading completely fake information that millions of people instantly started sharing. And then there were memes, which honestly became one of the weirdest and most uncomfortable part of this entire story, because while a potential rescue mission was actively happening, parts of the internet were already turning the situation into jokes. The Logitech controller became a massive talking point online, and people started mocking the passengers, especially because many viewed the expedition as some kind of reckless billionaire adventure. But at the exact same time, other people were desperately hoping those 5 passengers were still alive somewhere in the ocean. And that emotional split online made the entire situation feel surreal. Because underneath all the jokes and internet chaos was genuinely a horrifying possibility. If Titan was still intact somewhere underwater, those passengers would have been sitting in complete darkness inside a cramped vessel waiting for rescue, while oxygen levels slowly dropped hour after hour. No sunlight, no fresh air, and no way to escape. Just the sound of the ocean surrounding you from every direction. And all the while, the world above you counting down how long you might have left to live. Then another update changed everything. Reports began emerging that search teams had detected underwater noises in the area where Titan disappeared. Some outlets described them as banging sounds, and almost immediately, hope exploded online. People started believing the passengers may have been alive and trying to signal rescues from inside the submersible. News coverage intensified even more after that, because suddenly this no longer felt like a recovery mission. It felt like there still might be time. But even during all of this, there were sublet signs that some experts feared the reality was much worse. A few deep-sea specialists being interviewed seemed noticeably cautious whenever they discussed survival chances. Some openly explained how catastrophic a hull failure at the Titanic depth would be, while others carefully avoided giving direct optimism that rescue was possible. And looking back now, some people believe there may have already been private concern that Titan had suffered an implosion long before public fully understood what was happening. But publicly, the search continued. Ships kept scanning the Atlantic Ocean, rescue crews kept searching, and millions of people kept refreshing their phones waiting for an answer. Then eventually, as the oxygen countdown neared its end, remotely operated vehicles searching near the Titanic wreck site discovered debris on the ocean floor. When remotely operated vehicles finally reached the ocean floor near the wreck of the Titanic, search crews weren't looking at an intact submersible anymore. They were looking at debris. Fragments of the Titan had been discovered scattered near the Titanic wreck site, and almost immediately, the horrifying reality of what likely happened became unavoidable. Shortly afterwards, officials publicly confirmed that the Titan had suffered what was described as a catastrophic implosion. And just like that, the countdown the entire world had been obsessively watching for days suddenly stopped mattering. because according to experts, the passengers had likely died long before the search operation ever fully began. And this is where the story takes another deeply uncomfortable turn. Because reports later emerged suggesting the United States Navy may have detected acoustic evidence consistent with an implosion very early into the disappearance. According to multiple reports, underwater monitoring systems reportedly picked up a sound near the time communication with the Titan was lost. Now, publicly, officials continued the search and rescue effort because there was no immediate physical confirmation of what had happened. And obviously, you cannot officially declare 5 people dead based purely on preliminary acoustic analysis alone. But afterwards, for a lot of people, that revelation completely changed the emotional feeling surrounding the rescue mission. Because while the public spent days desperately hoping Titan was still somewhere underwater waiting to be rescued, there may have already been quiet fears behind the scenes that the ending had happened almost instantly. And the deeper you look into the implosion physics, the more terrifying that reality becomes. The Titanic depth, the pressure surrounding Titan, was absolutely overwhelming. Roughly 6,000 pounds per square inch, pressing against the hull from every direction. Every surface of the vessel carrying enormous force continuously while descending through the Atlantic Ocean. And if the hull failed even slightly under that pressure, there would have been no gradual flooding event and no dramatic Hollywood-style sinking sequence. Experts believe the implosion would have happened almost instantly, faster than the human brain could probably process. One moment, the passengers would have been sitting inside Titan listening to the sounds of the vessel descending through the ocean, and the next, the entire submersible would have collapsed inward under the force of the Atlantic Ocean. And honestly, this is one of those situations where the actual reality is far more disturbing than anything fictional, because the ocean at that depth is unimaginably violent. The pressure doesn't just crush things, it completely overwhelms them. There's no surviving it, no reacting to it, no realizing what's happening in time. Especially knowing everything we know now, the previous warnings, the lawsuits, the concerns from engineers, the reports about communication issues during early dives, the quotes from Stockton Rush himself about safety and regulations, all of it suddenly came rushing back into public conversation at once. And almost overnight, the narrative surrounding Titan completely changed. The jokes stopped feeling funny, the internet theories became quieter, and the story transformed from bizarre global speculation into a disaster that many people started viewing as tragically avoidable, especially after more information about the passengers themselves began spreading online. Because underneath all the headlines and the media frenzy were still 5 human beings who climbed into that submersible believing they were going to return. And somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, resting not far from the Titanic wreck itself, the remains of the Titan became another permanent reminder of what happens when human ambition collides with an environment completely beyond human control. After officials confirmed the Titan had suffered a catastrophic implosion, the story should have ended there, at least logically. The wreckage had been found, experts explained what likely happened, and the fate of the passengers was no longer really in question. But instead of ending, the story almost split into 2 completely different realities online. One side accepted the explanation immediately, catastrophic hull failure caused by extreme ocean pressure combined with years and years of ignored safety concerns. But the other side of the internet became obsessed with something else entirely. The idea that there was more to the story than the public was being told. And I mean, that's usually the case for everything told. Once you look at how the entire situation unfolded in real time, it's not hard to understand why people started spiraling into theories. Because from the outside, the entire thing felt strange. The world spent days watching a rescue count down, while reporters later suggested the United States Navy may have already detected acoustic evidence consistent with an implosion near the time communication was lost. And for a lot of people online, that immediately raised questions. Why continue the rescue narrative publicly if authorities may have privately suspected the passengers died almost instantly? Why were the banging noises heavily discussed in the media coverage if some experts already feared the submersible no longer existed intact? And why did the story seem to completely disappear from mainstream conversation almost immediately after the implosion was confirmed? Now, obviously, some of this does have logical explanations. Officials still needed physical confirmation before publicly declaring the passengers dead, especially in a situation this massive and internationally followed. Search crews also couldn't simply abandon rescue efforts based purely on preliminary acoustic data, but logic doesn't always stop internet theories, especially during a story this emotional. And within days, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, and conspiracy forums became flooded with speculation. Some people believed the government knew far more than it ever admitted publicly. Others claimed the rescue operations became more about controlling public reaction than actually finding survivors. There were theories that the banging noises were exaggerated to maintain hope and keep public attention focused on the rescue rather than the possibility authorities already suspected an implosion. Then the theories started becoming even more extreme. Some people claimed Titan was intentionally sabotaged. Others argued OceanGate was being protected from deeper scrutiny because of the wealthy connections and private exploration interests. There were even theories suggesting the Titanic wreck itself should have been left alone entirely, and that repeated expeditions to the site were somehow cursed or doomed from the beginning. And honestly, once the internet conspiracy culture grabs onto that story, it becomes almost impossible to stop, especially in modern media. Because the Titan disaster happened during a time where every major tragedy now unfolds publicly in real time online. Millions of people weren't just watching updates anymore, they were actively participating in the story itself. People were making AI-generated recreations before the search was even over. Fake screenshots claiming inside information spread across social media constantly. Random accounts pretended to have military connections or rescue knowledge. TikTok creators uploaded dramatic animation showing what they believed happened inside Titan, and millions of people consumed all of it almost immediately. And somewhere along the way, the line between documentary, entertainment, and tragedy became incredibly blurred. For a few days, the internet treated Titan almost like a global live stream event. People refreshed updates the same way they followed sports scores or breaking celebrity drama. Entire channels exploded in popularity overnight, just covering theories and oxygen countdowns, while the possibility of 5 real people dying in the Atlantic Ocean became content for millions of viewers. And then, the second the implosion was confirmed, everything vanished almost immediately. The memes slowed down, the live stream stopped, the countdowns disappeared, and the internet moved on to the next thing, which left a lot of people afterwards asking a really uncomfortable question. Did the world actually care about the people on board? Or were people just addicted to the mystery? Because once the mystery ended, so did most of the attention. But despite all of those conspiracies and online speculation, one thing remained impossible to ignore. For years, experts warned about the dangers surrounding Titan. Former employees raised concerns, engineers questioned the hull, industry professionals reportedly pushed for stronger oversight. And through all of it, OceanGate continued descending deeper into the harshest environments on Earth, believing innovation would somehow outrun risk. But the ocean doesn't negotiate with confidence. It doesn't care about ambition, wealth, internet fame, or revolutionary ideas. Now, in the months following the implosion, investigations into OceanGate and the disaster surrounding Titan only continued to grow. More interviews surfaced, more internal details became public, more experts spoke out, and the deeper investigators looked into OceanGate's operations, the more questions people started asking about how this was ever allowed to happen in the first place. Former employees continued speaking about concerns they allegedly raised years earlier. Industry professionals revisited the warnings that had reportedly been ignored, and investigators began examining everything from Titan's hull construction and testing procedures to OceanGate's overall safety practices and expedition planning. And honestly, one of the strangest parts of this entire story is that almost none of the major warning signs were actually hidden. A lot of them were public. People questioned the experimental design. People questioned Stockton Rush's attitude towards regulation. People questioned repeated deep-sea dives using a carbon fiber hull. And despite all of that, the expeditions continued. Because success has a dangerous way of convincing people they're untouchable. Every successful dive likely made OceanGate more confident. Every completed expedition made criticism easier to dismiss. Until eventually, confidence stopped looking like confidence and started looking more like denial. Following the implosion, OceanGate suspended operations and public conversation around deep-sea tourism shifted almost immediately. What had once been marketed as groundbreaking exploration suddenly looked reckless to a huge portion of the world. And I honestly think the Titan disaster forced a lot of people to confront something uncomfortable about modern culture in general. We've become obsessed with pushing limits. Not just exploring anymore, but constantly going further, deeper, higher, and more extreme than the people before us. And normally, that ambition leads to incredible discoveries. But once in a while, people become so focused on proving something can be done that they stop asking whether it should be done the way they're doing it. And when the environment you're dealing with is the deep ocean, mistakes become permanent very quickly. Because the Atlantic Ocean doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care about innovation. It doesn't care about wealth, reputation, or how badly somebody wants to make history. And people didn't become obsessed with the Titan because of the implosion itself. It was everything surrounding it. The countdown, the internet obsession, the theories, the possibility that some officials may have privately feared the outcome long before the public did. That image of 5 passengers descending into darkness believing they were about to see one of the most famous shipwrecks in history, never realizing themselves they were about to become part of a tragedy the entire world would watch unfold in real time. And out of everyone on board, I think the story of Solomon DeWood is probably the hardest part to shake, because underneath all of the headlines, theories, and internet chaos was still a 19-year-old kid who reportedly wasn't even fully comfortable making the trip in the first place. And once you strip everything else away, that's really what tragedies like this come down to. Real people, real fear, and real consequences. Not content or entertainment. Just people. And now, somewhere deep in the North Atlantic Ocean, not far from the Titanic wreck itself, the remains of the Titan now sit permanently in the same darkness that fascinated humanity enough to send people searching for it in the first place. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. And if you find yourself coming back for more deep dives into stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. I'd also genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this case down in the comments, and if there's a case, mystery, or story you'd like to see me cover in the future, whether it's popular, or something barely anybody talks about, leave it down below and I'll do my best to cover it in a future deep dive. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, and stay spooky. See you next time.